Okay, so this is the third section of the Harlem Hellfighters. I do want to give some background. The question on this one isn't really fair to you guys. So we didn't realize when we uploaded this that we kind of missed the experiences that they had with the American training. And so I'm just going to go ahead and sum what that was like for them. So in the United States, they did not train the colored units fighting because they were told that they weren't going to fight. They were told that they would not see action, that they would be doing manual labor jobs. So they weren't given guns, they weren't given training. They were in a segregated unit, meaning that they would not be with any white soldiers. So they experienced hardships in that, and they wanted to fight for their country. That was their purpose. They wanted to go fight for the United States. Like I said before, they had more to prove than the white soldiers. They were trying to get themselves a place within society that was more just. So some of the soldiers took it upon themselves to find themselves weapons and to train themselves. But eventually they were kind of given to the French army. And so they fought alongside the French, who, of course, were allies with the United States. So this is their experiences now with the French army and their training there and the way in which they were received. So we're going to go through this, and our questions here are, how were they treated, within the United States Army military versus how they were treated by the French. And then also, what are some commonalities? What were the things that they experienced within both regiments? And like I said, it wasn't really fair to you guys, this question, but we'll work it out. So here we have a general saying, "Welcome to the Army of the Republic of France." Okay, he's a commander. Sorry. It says, General Henry Gouraud was commander of the French Fourth Army. They didn't call him the Lion of France for nothing. Even with one arm blown off, he couldn't wait to wrap up the other around the Kaiser's throat. So here it says, while attached to our forces, you will also be treated as equals. Under our fragile skin flows the same red blood, and together we shall spill that blood in defense of our beloved France. So he's welcoming in these Black soldiers and telling them that they're going to experience equality, something that they have never experienced by any white people in society. So that was a foreign thing for them to think about. Like, they hadn't even thought of this as a possibility because the society that they saw, the representation of white society within the United States, was vastly different. And here they're saying liberty, equality, fraternity. So, like, we're going to treat you as equal. We're going to treat you as brothers. And they kind of doubted this. They were like, are they lying to us? Are they just telling us what we want to hear because we're here to fight with them? Maybe. So he says, I had no way of telling if the Blue Boys were really less prejudiced than our own army, or if they were just happy to see somebody willing to give them a hand. So they were kind of hesitant to believe them. They wanted to experience that. I mean, everybody wants to feel welcome. Everybody wants to feel, equal in society and that they have some sort of power and respect. Nobody wants to feel ostracized and lesser than. It's not a good feeling. And this is something that these soldiers had experienced their entire lives. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're, reading through this, that the nuances, the things that they experienced that wasn't, blatantly horrific, but it's mentally taxing. So, they were kind of reluctant to believe that these white people were going to treat them well. So as we go through, it says, we were issued French equipment and rations, which included French wine, which wasn't too shabby, French rifles, which were, it says they were old, They had 3-round magazines and they shot out barrels. They really looked as tired as and beat up as the men who was carrying them for all these years, because they've been in battle for 3 years. We joined in late. So here they talk about the smell. So they're going to be going into the trenches. This is trench warfare. This is the first time that trench warfare has really taken place because of the new technologies that they were fighting with. Really didn't allow for people to just run at one another. Machine guns killed people rapidly. And so they have this area between the trenches called no man's land, which is basically you don't go up there unless you want to die. So, these soldiers don't really know what to expect in this conflict when they first get there. So they're talking about the smells, which I could imagine aren't good. They're all these men living in these trenches, so living in these dug holes that were miles and miles long. So we have to think of how they were using the restroom, how they were keeping clean. It probably wasn't very sanitary. They're also in mud. There would be some complications with that. And then they're also in war. So there's going to be bodies involved with some of this smell. It says it was a mix of charcoal, gunpowder, unwashed bodies, and rotten meat. So that doesn't really give it a very good depiction. I wouldn't want to be there. So here we go through. It says, ironically, the worst smells were the nice ones, sweet and spicy, like flowers and onions, and the faintest whiff of mustard. So I don't know. I would imagine the rotten meat would be worse, but. And here they're longing to smell, fresh mowed grass or anything other than what they're smelling. They say if you hear a gas alarm, you need to put on your mask. This was the first time that chemical warfare was used. So they had gas masks. The use of chemical warfare was not necessarily to kill everybody, but it was to hinder them enough to make them easier to kill. So gas masks were bulky. It didn't allow for great visibility, and we'll see that a little bit later. So here somebody says, when are we going to advance? When are we going to, go towards them? When are we going to fight the fight? And they are kind of taken aback because they've been doing this for 3 years. They've been in these trenches fighting this war for 3 years. So they're like, we're not advancing. This is war. This is where we're staying. These trenches are where we're fighting. And to get comfortable, this is home. Which isn't what they wanted. I mean, if you look here at their faces, obviously that wasn't the answer that they wanted. So they were living the same way as the enemy in trenches, but the enemy was just a couple hundred yards away. So they were, shooting towards the enemy was shooting towards them. Sometimes they would have battles in no man's land, but that was basically the experience of World War I. So here somebody looks up above the trenches and gets killed. Lots of people, like I said, died in this war. 16 million people is what they think. And so that was like their first eye-opening experience, like, okay, we're staying in these trenches. The trenches are safer. So it says, we learned all about the new toys of modern warfare, barbed wire, landmines, and a real doozy called the machine gun. Thought up by some American-born Englishmen who supposedly got the idea when someone told him, if you want to make a pile of money, invent something that would let Europeans cut each other's throats with greater facility. Here we can see, this would be like no man's land. We can see all the bodies here. It's hard because it's in black and white to really see the brutality that's depicted in this scene. But you can kind of see here is some barbed wire. Here's, it looks like a machine gun going off here. And people are trying to advance on one another, and it just isn't worth it. So some people called it the sewing machine, the coffee mill, the riveter, whatever you want to call it. This gun changed everything about war, except the minds of the generals running it. So there was a lot of technological advances that happened before, during World War I, but the military strategy didn't really advance alongside with it. So these people had been military generals for a long time, and they didn't know what ways to bring these new technological advances into war. So they were still trying to fight the old way. Um, People would just kind of go shoot each other, hand to hand combat, things like that, which we do see a little bit during World War I. But, there were also things that were happening during World War I that had never happened before. We have airplanes that can drop bombs. We have tanks. We have submarines. I mean, there's so much more during this war. And the mental capacity to apply these new technologies really hadn't been achieved yet. So they that's one of the main reasons that they think that there were so many casualties, because people didn't know how deadly and how to prevent these types of deaths. So here they're talking about Verdun, which was a really deadly battle. We'll learn about that in another exercise. The Battle of the Somme, where 20,000 British people died in just the first day of this battle. And that battle went on for months, but 20,000 people died in one day in this one battle. So meanwhile, he says that it would be like 10,000 people dying a day for 4 years. There are other battles going on during the Battle of the Somme elsewhere. So I would wonder what the entire death count for just that first day of the Battle of the Somme really is, if we added up all of the other battles that were also fought during that time. And then this war also creates a really horrible psychological impact for a lot of the soldiers. They called it shell shock. It would be called like PTSD today. But here they're talking about the death of the mind. So he says personalities that just crumbled to dust, breathing statues that stared silently into darkness. Like the Spanish flu, it became such an epidemic that doctors finally got around to giving it a name, shell shock. So the Spanish flu was happening in 1919, right at the end of World War I. It was much like the pandemic that we're experiencing today. It was a airborne illness. It was spread rapidly through society. Luckily for them, it was a flu. So flus are seasonal. So once the season's over, it kind of dies out. Whereas, COVID-19 doesn't have that seasonality aspect to it. But, the Spanish flu killed a lot of people, and World War I killed a lot of people. So we had, a massive population shift during this time. So it says that they call them zombies, the living dead, talking about, how horrible. And that was caused by, overstimulation, nonstop stimulus happening with gunfire, and you're living in these trenches and all of these terrible experiences. You're witnessing, people dying all the time. And, people can be traumatized by much less than that. And for these people to have experienced so much psychological trauma, it's probably surprising that more people didn't end up with PTSD at this severe stage that they called shell shock. It says we learned about no man's land, which was, as I said before, the land between the trenches, so between the enemy and yourselves. Here they're talking about their days of training. So while they're in the trenches, they're getting trained. They are trained on what they're going to be doing, and then they also have to do chores. So it says, they're kind of they're oscillating between training, chores, and waiting around during the day in these trenches. So it says, we learned that we weren't the only Black troops fighting for the French. They also had colonial units. So France had colonized certain areas in Africa. There was the scramble for Africa. They kind of divided Africa between, all these different European countries. So Morocco and Senegal were French colonies. So And they still speak French today in Morocco and probably in Senegal as well. And that's because of colonization. So, colonization is its own topic, but they had these other people fighting for the French too. And they didn't really speak French, so they couldn't really communicate with these people. And they found a way to communicate was to do trade with one another. So they were able to make friends with these people who they didn't have a language to speak through trade. They would, trade goods back and forth. And that built, a friendship and camaraderie and, really kind of bound these people together. So somebody says, these are your people, why don't you speak African to them? And that's another one of those misconceptions, is that, Africa is not a country, for one. There's also not a language called African. Africa is a continent. It's a very large continent, and there are many countries within Africa. And some thousand languages, I think, are spoken in Africa, with all kinds of different, roots of languages and dialects. So, speaking African is not really something that can happen because that's not a language. So here somebody says, you can't even imagine how vast our motherland is. So, going back to that African diaspora, is that, many of the people who ended up within the United States due to slavery came from Western Africa, but they were also captured from other parts of Africa and sold to Western Africa to be sold as slaves to come to the United States. And it's really sad how people have lost their heritage due to that horrific institution that was happening with slavery. So, today people can get those genetic tests, which is kind of cool, and find their heritage, but it's really sad that that's what they have to do to know where they came from. And that's due to this, policy of enslavement. So here it says they have nothing in common. They're just from Africa, which isn't really true. They have that bond. And let's see. So here it goes into some of like the less luxurious parts of being in the trenches, even though I don't know that they had much luxury going on at all. But they did have rats. They talk about rats and they talk about lice. So one guy kills this rat and it says, you should have used the blunt side. Now we're going to have to clean it up. And he says, somebody mentions the bodies that are in no man's land, and the rats would have, eaten those bodies. And it says, we're going to have to clean up no man's land. So we need the rats. And, that's a really grotesque thing to think about, but that was their realities that they were experiencing. War is not, something that is clean and positive. War is messy, and a lot of times it's something that no one would ever want to go through. People who have gone through it wouldn't wish that on anyone, to go through that. So here they're kind of, thinking about their experiences in the trenches with lice and rats and dirt and smells. And they see these soldiers who are flying these airplanes. And they're like, man, wouldn't that be great to be able to just get out of this trench and fly, get out of the smell. The air would be, great. And somebody says, the only time you're ever going to fly is if you die. And another person says, and that's only if heaven has a colored section. So, going back to their experiences, the way that they experience life has this mental toll on them that is unimaginable. I mean, talking about the afterlife in a way that you don't even know if you're going to be suitable to go to the place that you believe in. So these people, there's many African American Christians who believe in God, who believe in heaven. And because of the society in which that they live, they don't even know if heaven is an option for them, because in society, that's kind of how they're treated. I know I went on for way too long, and I apologize. But so in this one, we're going to talk about, how they were treated in the United States Army, what their commonalities were, and how they were treated with the French. So what I would say with the United States Army, I would say that, they were treated unequally. They weren't trained. They weren't given weapons. They were treated as less than second-class citizens, that they were segregated. So there was a lot of inequality, inequity happening within the United States Army. For the French, we can say things like they were treated as soldiers. They were respected. They were given guns. They were given training. They were treated well by, the commanding officers above them. They were treated as they deserved to be treated. They were treated like soldiers. They were treated like somebody who was willing to fight. And that was a vast difference from how they were treated within the United States Army. As far as commonalities, I would say that, it was war regardless of their experiences on both sides. So you could say something like they had to mentally prepare for getting ready to fight. They still had to mentally work out, what it was to be a soldier. That could be something that you talk about. Both of the militaries were going to fight in Europe. The fight wasn't at home. It was across the Atlantic. So just things like that. It can be really basic for the commonalities, because these armies were so divergent. They were so different that it's hard to find the commonalities. The United States didn't even give them guns. So we can't even compare the guns that they got, between. So that's kind of what we're looking for there. So, like I said before, if you have any questions, if you have any trouble with these assignments, always, always feel free to put the questions in the comments. We will get to those. If you do make a question in the comment, I do ask you to submit your assignment, because I won't be able to see it unless it's submitted. Mr. Mudd gets comment notifications, but I don't. So it's harder for me to see those comments. But if you submit it, I will see that you submitted an assignment, and I will look at it. I'm always willing to help any of you if you need it. We can meet during office hours for any assignment. But anyway, that's the end of this one, and I'll see you in the next video.